Enid, Oklahoma, 19th, 19th of June, 1972. Ferris N. Wheeler interviewing Mrs. And what is your name?
Anna T. Scruggs.
And you just go right ahead with anything. You live here in this area.
I moved to Oklahoma in 1924. I was reared in New Orleans, and we hear a great deal about pioneering in this state. I had been raised in a home where I had never washed a handkerchief. My husband was a Rock Island telegrapher and stationed here in Enid, Oklahoma. And of course, all railroad men wish to die on a farm, and so we purchased a farm just across the road from the institution. And I had never seen an cook stove. We had bought a majestic stove that used coal, one of these old-fashioned ones, and I either burnt everything up or let the fire go out. We used all the money we had to pay down on the place, and of course I was not aware that it froze in this part of the country, having never seen snow before. And so we had a big tank built for fresh water and put what cash we had into a bathroom. And my first experience pioneering in Oklahoma back in 1924 was the tank during the night. Sometime it turned real cold and the tank froze. And of course that meant the bathroom, which was our pride and joy, was unusable. And we were going into the poultry business, and like many of these folks who read catalogs, why my husband had bought two white leghorn hens and a rooster for $25. We were going to make a fortune, and they came from down at Bowie, Texas. And that particular night, a skunk got in and got the rooster, and of course that ended the project. We had moved into this little house that was purchased from one of Oklahoma pioneers, the man who gave the land, which is now the Iowa Ranch, to Oklahoma. And we purchased it from him as he was retiring. It was an old white house, and one of the most terrifying experiences, I think, was that we found out after we had moved in that the place was infested with bed bugs. And so every bit of the furniture was placed in little tin cans full of kerosene until we could get it cleaned up. I have one son who was at that time 4 years old, and he went to Adams School a little later on. But knowing nothing at all about the handling of land or anything of the sort, I was certainly in a much worse position than a pioneer who came in here expecting to find this, because I had always had running water and gas and that sort of thing. So this is one thing that I think perhaps led to my future in Oklahoma. We lived there for a number of years, and as Heine Bass's brother has a very wonderful pecan orchard here west of town, my husband decided that we'd make a fortune by planting the whole 20 acres of the front of it to pecans, which we did, and purchased hose to water them, and of course they promptly all died. And then we decided we'd raise strawberries, which was another down in the sand. And if any of you remember, that particular area were the Dust Bowl days, and the dust promptly blew all the strawberries out of the ground, and that was another one of those things that you learn to live with. But I became interested in home demonstration groups, and the very first demonstration given by Mary Ruff, who was our home demonstration agent at the time, was given at my home. And today we think if we have to go walk 8 or 10 blocks, it's pretty bad. But in those days, we went to club. It was about the only activity we had outside of church, and we went to club many times in a wagon. Mr. Fred Suter, who was one of the old pioneers, well known to Earl Evans, who is one of our people here today, uh, would take his wagon and put wash benches, they called them then, because we washed on a rub board. And he'd set the wash benches in, put hay in the bottom, and come by and pick us all up, and we'd go through the mud to club and meet in the little church in the neighborhood, which was rather interesting. I think had I not had that experience, I could not have gone on because as my son grew up, we began, bought 2 or 3 Jersey cows, and we milked and sold the cream, and I'm proud of the fact that he has 3 degrees in music, went to school all through school at Adams and Longfellow and Phillips, and has 3 degrees in music, and was an honor student there. And of course we milked and raised blackberries, and I picked blackberries when it was 109 on the 4th of July because nobody else wanted to pick on that day. But those are the kind of experiences, I think, that possibly a girl coming from a very sheltered home where I was not allowed out after 8 o'clock in the evening in New Orleans, coming to that sort of a thing was quite unusual. But when the Phillips Band was inducted in later years into the National Guard, all of the Phillips Band members were members of the National Guard, and it was inducted, I think, in 1939 or 40 for 1 year of service, and my son was the president of the band at the time, and Milburn Carey was the director. And of course I was left alone. I didn't know how to milk. I hadn't learned how to do that. I knew how to can, and I took every course that was given. And I think one real funny and interesting thing that might be of interest to you, I traded blackberries to the Shores family for an old gray mare, which the children enjoyed tremendously. And then I traded another one for a sow. And when the sow had her pigs, of course, we raised them until they were butchering size. The neighbors butchered a calf, and we butchered a cow. And so I didn't know anything about making sausage except what I learned through the club work and in through reading, a great deal of reading, I should say, to get by. And so the neighbors decided that if we'd give them 1 pig, they would give us half of the calf they were butchering, and we'd make sausage. So I called on the telephone, and we were the first one off of the line, and so we could always get Enid. And the neighbors would call me to find out whether or not if I'd ring Enid for them, then they could call through, and there were 17 on the line, so it was rather interesting sometimes. If you had a call in the night, you'd hear all the telephone receivers coming up, which was one of the indoor pastimes before television and radio. And so I decided, well, if other people could make sausage, I could make it too, and I got the recipe. And Mr. and Mrs. Suter were going to town on Saturdays. We always went to town to the old Frank Hawkins grocery store to get our groceries. And they said, well, now tell you what you do. These people will bring down the hog entrails, and you turn them inside out, and then lay them flat on the board and scrape them. Well, of course, I didn't know how to turn them inside out. And so I did do a lot of sewing, and my grandmother had taught me to crochet and knit and sew. And so I took a safety pin and run all those through the safety pin, and then laid them out and scratched them on. So scraped them off. So on the way home from town, Mr. Suter said, well, how did you get along with your casings for your sausage? And I said, oh, I've got them turned and I've got them scraped. And he said, well, how did you do it? And I said, oh, I just took a safety pin. Well, of course, that was the laugh of the neighborhood because the proper thing to do is to put a little water in it and then they'll go right straight through if you know what you're doing. But anyway, I spent a half a day getting those casings turned and we made the sausage and it was a great success and we enjoyed doing that. So my husband, at the time that my son went to the year of service, it was to be for 1 year, and they were federalized in August and became the 189th in the 45th Division. However, he was fortunate enough to have enlisted in August, so he came out. The rest of the boys went on, and many of them did die. My husband contracted tuberculosis during that time, and there I sat with 300 turkeys, 1,250 white leghorn chickens, and a great big garden, and a lot of other milk customers and so forth. But you know, your neighbors are always in this part of the country. Your neighbors always pitch in, and one of the Shores boys came over and taught me to milk. There were two things I said I would never do. I would never milk, and I would never drive in the mud. And I found out a long time ago, never say never. That's one thing we should never do. But the Shores boy taught me to milk, and I managed to do it. And some of my friends here, I had worked in the Home Demonstration Club in the year prior to my husband's hospitalization. I was president of the Garfield County Council, statewide council of home demonstration clubs. And so shortly after that, it was Dr. Nielsen felt that I should not be there alone trying to do this, and the National Youth Administration at that time was having some difficulty in securing a director for the girls' work. So it was possibly 1939, I believe, or so, that I was asked to assume that. Well, of course, I couldn't very well get rid of the farm. That was my husband's dream, and he was in the hospital, and he had every hope of being soon able to resume his part, even though he were working part-time. But Dr. Nielsen said we had 5 years, and that would be it. So he wanted me to prepare myself for the future. So I was asked to take this girls' work, which I did. We were given the old armory, and if you've ever been in the armory, it was built of the brick which was taken out of the streetcar tracks. When the streetcars were taken out of Enid, the Enid Armory was built of those bricks, and they were about as rough and as anyone could imagine, and everything, of course, was painted gray. So we had nothing to work with. The understanding was that $16 a month would be paid to the youth who were part of the National Youth Administration program, and those youth were given, the federal government paid the salary, the city was required to furnish the place, and then the board, which was composed of Mrs. Garber and the mayor and the superintendent of schools and several other very prominent citizens, were to provide the material. Of course, it usually wound up with the director getting out and getting things, which meant that about every time my friends saw me coming, they wondered what I was going to ask for next in the way of things that people didn't want, and I couldn't miss the opportunity to say that the manager of Sears would call and say, Anna, if you'll drive up to the back door, I have a whole box of stuff that you might be able to use. Well, Mr. George Failing, and I think one of the greatest thrills of my life has been the work that I did with him. He gave us the carbide, and we painted the inside of that armory. I don't know how high that ceiling is, but it's at least 20 and possibly 30 feet high. But we painted the entire thing with whitewash made of carbide and starch and so forth. And then the American Business Club, of which Kenneth Martin was a very prominent member and is a very prominent individual in this town, gave us a gallon of paint at a time. And those were the days when you could only get things by old coupons or something of the sort. And he gave us a gallon of paint, and another businessman would give us one. So we painted the floors gray, and then took a sponge and dotted it with different colors, and we used gunny sacks and embroidered Indians and to make it look a little bit better. And we called it our Indian club room, and entertained. We were given commodities, but nothing else except cornmeal and that sort of thing. So it was our job to teach the girls how to use what we had and make it acceptable. And they were taught, the state furnished a teacher to give them instructions in the morning, and the National Youth Administration in the afternoons was responsible for production. And we fed them their noon meal, and for many of them it was the only, the $16 was the only money coming into the family, and that was probably the only meal that some of them had. And in those days the cemetery was about, the old cemetery was about the boundary, and many of those people lived in shacks and came barefooted or with some old shoes that someone had given them. And there were just water hydrants about every 4 or 5 houses. And many a morning the girls would come to work, and you could see where they'd spattered water over their legs, where they'd gotten a bucket of water to take in to cook the meal. And it was our job to teach them the niceties and some etiquette, and give them something to look forward to. One of the outstanding projects, I think, since Mother's Day hasn't been too long ago, was to, and the Vaughters, John Vaughters, an old pioneer who has passed on, he gave us a lot of colored paper. And we started out and had the girl, first of all, we said, well, you have to learn to comb your hair and keep yourself clean. Nowadays, with these long hairs, we don't think too much about it, but then it was a problem. So we decided they couldn't afford to buy shampoo, so we solicited all of the scraps of ivory soap and melted it and made shampoo, and then we taught each girl how to shampoo her hair. And we were getting ready for the Mother's Day party. They would each invite their mother to the party. And in order to do it, we used a teaching method as well as the ultimate program. So we had the girls wash their hair and straighten up their skirts. It used to be a saying that you could tell an NYA girl because her petticoat was always hanging crooked. So we taught them how to straighten up their skirts and hem them up and get them up in shape. And through that effort, we made little programs and wrote invitations and went through the process and practiced over and over again as to how we would serve the mothers and who would entertain them and this sort of thing. So we had one of the outstanding programs. As time went along, the boys were on the lower floor, and there were 5 shops, aircraft sheet metal and 2 kinds of welding, auto mechanics, and woodwork. And as people began going to shipyards and boys being drafted for the war and that sort of thing, why, it became very evident that there was going to have to be some supportive measures to that program, because they were beginning then to think in terms of a 24-hour shift for training in order to get enough workers for the shipyards and the aircraft companies. So it was decided that I should be the personnel officer to place these people, and the girls would serve the meals and do the and many of the girls did go into woodwork. And this was the first project in the nation that girls were trained for aircraft sheet metal and welding and that sort of thing. And Mr. Georgie Failing hired the first girls that were hired. And I was happy to see his plant is now back under his name again, which was West Banco for a number of years. And he came out to the place, and I always will believe he was a great lover of color. I will always believe that the thing that sold him on the hiring the girls was the fact that they were all spotless, clean, the place was clean, and there was so much color. And this is one of the things that he enjoyed. And so shortly after that, the director of the project, many of them, of course, were college people who had an opportunity to go back into the Navy or at better jobs and that sort of thing, and they began leaving. And the director decided to leave, and John Everett, who is one of our pioneers here and was on our board, as well as Mr. Bass, decided that perhaps he could use some of the girls. Well, I went down to see him, and of course he wasn't very much interested. He thought they'd cause more trouble than they would good, and I said, well, I know a woman who is a widow, who has 3 children. She needs to work, and if you will hire the girls, we'll train her as a storeroom operator, and she'll be responsible for the girls. So that was done, and just a few years ago, this Mrs. Sanders, who taught knitting for years at Newman's and had a hard time raising her family, did complete the course, and Mr. Failing hired the first girls who were hired. As a result of that, we got some publicity, of course, and we brought in a few Indian boys, a number of Indian boys, from Shalako. And they were rather hard to handle because they speak very little, and they're very distant and a little hard to reach. And so those boys, some of them very talented artists. In fact, 2 of their pictures are in Bob Kerr's collection. And so during that time, it became very evident that it would not be too long until the National Youth Administration would not be needed. And just before Senator Kerr became governor, I knew his wife quite well. He came to me and said that it looked like this kind of thing was going to happen. Well, in the meantime, the director of the project at ENID, the National Youth Administration, left, and Bruce Carter, who was later the president of A&M at Miami, came up, and he said, well, Anna, it's going to be necessary for you to take over the project. And I said, oh my goodness, no, I wouldn't think of such a thing, because in the first place, these men, we had specialists from Cessna and all of these different places who were instructing. I said, why, those men wouldn't work for a woman, and they're all highly talented people with many extra degrees, and here I am with just a high school education. I wouldn't think of it. And he said, well, you've been doing the work all the time, because we realized the director's been playing golf quite a bit. And so our board decided, I didn't know it for several years later, and Mrs. Garber and I think Heine Bass was involved, but Mr. Everett went to the city and said, well, they thought that it would be too bad to bring a stranger in here, because we had so many contacts by having given voluntarily through the church, and I belonged to the Methodist Church since 1924, people know that things will be done as they are stated. So we would like to see this project operated. So on one Sunday morning, Bruce Carter called me at home, and he said, I'd like you to meet me at the project. And I said, well, I'll be glad to. So I went down, and he said, well, as of tomorrow morning, you will be in charge. And I said, oh no, that I will just have to quit. My husband was in the hospital. My son was in the Army. In the meantime, he had, of course, gone on into service, and I was alone. And when it rained, I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and drive the car in the mud up to the front of the institution and walk, carry the cream and the eggs to the store. And but it was all right. We made it. And he said, well, I want you to do it. And I said, well, now we have people here who are these very talented department heads. One of them was the man who was the pattern maker later for George Failing. And I said, no, I can't do that because these people will not accept a woman. They accepted me on personality because that was all routine, placing of youth and that sort of thing, but I couldn't do that. So he said, well, you be in charge in the morning. And I said, well, I'll probably have to resign because I just know that's an impossibility. And of course I was some years younger than I am now, at least 25 or more, and 30 possibly. And I thought that was just too much to ask. And so he laid before me a letter, and it was one of the highlights of my life. Outside of induction of the Hall of Fame, I think perhaps that was one of the top things, signed by every supervisor on the project, including the men from Cessna, requesting that if a change was to be made, that they would like to see me be the director. Well, I thought there's two ways to look about it. They thought perhaps I'd be the easiest to get along with, and then the other thing was that perhaps they thought maybe one of their group would be chosen, and it might not be one that they liked so well. But at any rate, we had the distinction of making the furniture for the naval base down at Norman. We made clothing for the dungarees for these people. We had our shops operated beautifully, and there was a safety contest held, and it's always been a rather interesting thing to me. We had this, I happened to run across a picture in the old, one of the old magazines that's out of production now. I think it was Liberty, and it showed the picture of a woman, the Statue of Liberty, holding the torch. And we were asked to, each project was asked to enter a picture depicting something about the National Youth Administration. Well, we were one that had girls who were working, and the girls wore white uniforms with a little small inch size NYA on the cuff. The boys wore striped coveralls with NYA across the cuff. And so in the night, I happened to think, well, now, why couldn't we? We have this talented Indian boy. Why couldn't I just take that picture and see if he can draw something that we can enter? So we drew a small a sketch. I can't draw, but then I outlined it for him. And we had the picture of the girl holding a acetylene welding torch, and her NYA showing on her cuff, and a boy holding a hammer, and then above it the Statue of Liberty, the Torch of Liberty, and down at the bottom we use the title, Tools or Torches of Freedom. And we sent it in and won the first prize in the nation. Mrs. Roosevelt, that was her project, and sent us the first picture that she had ever had made in an evening dress. So, of course, we were quite pleased about that. It was a national thing, and the prize was given to us in Austin. And so we went down, and of course, the former President Johnson had been a National Youth Administration director, state director, and was then a congressman. And when we went down to receive the, we didn't know who won, but we went to to the program. And when it was announced that Oklahoma had won it and the Enid Project had won it, I will always remember the president's remarks. You mean to tell me Oklahoma has beat us and it's run by a woman? And so it was rather interesting to follow his career in later years, even though he's one of my very favorite people. But shortly after that, it appeared that the National Youth Administration would be going out of business. There was nobody else to train. Everybody had jobs, and it was not possible to place anyone else. The war was winding up, and so when Governor Kerr was elected, the person who had been selected, and if you know anything about the state school for the retarded, north of town here, or east of town, north and east, it had always been given, each 4 years, the superintendent had been appointed. Whoever had managed the governor's campaign in this area was given that job, and it was always a 4-year assignment. Well, I had not worked for him because I was under the Hatch Act, and of course I couldn't take any part. But he came to me and asked if I would mind to take it. He wanted very much for me to do that, and so I said, well, no, I just don't believe I should do it. He said, well, I'll promise you this. If you'll take it and clean it up, I'll be there 4 years. If you'll take it and clean it up, I'm going to run for the Senate, and there'll always be a job for you at Kerr-McGee. And, of course, by that time, my husband had passed away, and my son was still a director. He was director of gunnery at that time down in Texas and was getting ready to be married, and I was alone. So I thought, well, I'd never been in the place, lived across the road from it for a good many years, but I'd never been in it because it was tightly locked up in every way, shape, and form. So I said, well, I had nothing to lose. I'd try it. So I was there 18 and a half years, and that's the longest term that anybody ever served in that particular place. I'm happy to say that when I went there, I wasn't very happy about what I found. There were bars on all the windows, and the front doors were all locked, and it was one of those things that we didn't have any freedom of any kind. We had one teacher who taught English. She had 2 pupils in an algebra and a sandbox, and we got movies once a week, once a month from the health department. But the only place they were shown was on the 2nd floor, and people who needed it most in wheelchairs and cripples could not go, of course. So we immediately began trying to get people who had helped us before and were willing to help. And the greatest, I think, accomplishment then was to organize the parents, because people who have retarded children then, back in 1943, would not talk about them. They brought them to the institution. They were admitted by court. Parents had nothing whatsoever to say about them, and they were admitted by the court and discharged by the superintendent for any good reason. And so we organized a parents group in '49, and at that time were able to encourage them to come to visit more often and to take their children out and to do things. When I went there, there was not a record player or a radio or any kind, not even a deck of cards for the children. And the thing that impressed me most was these boys who worked on the farm, and we had one of the top herds in the state of Oklahoma when I left there. In fact, it was the top herd of Holsteins. They were milking by hand, and the milk was not pasteurized nor homogenized, and it was being sent to the building. The first thing we did was to get water wells that would meet health approval. There were all the windows had bars on them, and it took 14 years to get the bars all taken off because we had to do it in spare time when there was and not much help. We had 1,400 patients, and one building that later housed 28 had 78 bed patients in it, and it was just simply terrible. They were cooking in great big pots and carrying the stuff upstairs and feeding them the same spoon, dip into a bowl and feed two or three, and it was a tragic situation. We began enlisting the Ministerial Alliance and some of the businessmen and people like that to help us. And since I was alone, I had plenty of time and had no secretary. We had one telephone and an 80-year-old night watchman who was afraid of the dark. And if he heard a noise and thought that there was somebody down at the chicken house, why, he'd come over and ring my doorbell and light his lantern and take the lantern with him. And so we'd go down to see if there were people and there was a path you could tell that somebody had been in there stealing chicken. So we promptly moved the chicken area across the lake way to the back and put a man and wife into a small apartment that was built on it so it could be watched, and started a brooder project, both hatching and brooding. And when I left there, we were butchering 500 fryers every Tuesday and every Friday, all of which were consumed at the institution by the children. We had 3 large, and those were built one at a time, as we had time, with our own help, not under contract. With our own help, we produced all of the eggs that we used. We had quite large gardens and did quite a bit of canning, and I think all of these things would not have been possible had I not had to take this pioneer training early in my life. I could not have accepted such a thing. We started a school, and when Roy Turner was elected, of course, when Bob Kerr's time was up, and he and Roy Turner were not good personal friends, but after Roy Turner was the nominee, he pitched in and helped. And so the day after the election, he called me, and I had already written a letter I had set up an organized chart that I was accustomed at the federal setup, and you know, if they lose 1 penny, they'll spend $500 to find it. And so I was accustomed in the federal setup for everything to be up to date every day as we left. We never left the building unless it was completely cleaned and everything was accounted for. And so it was my feeling that perhaps the governor would have someone he would choose as his as my successor. And I didn't know Mr. Turner, but I wrote a letter that morning after the election and complimented him on his election, thanked him for the opportunity to have worked there, and asked him to consider that my resignation to be accepted at his discretion. So I had already mailed the letter, and Bob Kerr, secretary, called and said, "The governor wishes to speak with you." And so he said, "Anna, can you come down in an hour or so?" And I said, "Well, I had the flu," and I said, "I will try." And that was our motto, "I'll try," on NYA, and it was our motto on the institution. And I still get letters from former employees say, "Stella, I'm still trying." And so I went down, and he said, "We're going over to Roy Turner's home." And I said, "Oh, I don't know Roy Turner." And he said, "Well, now, Anna, we are going over there." So we went. I had to have somebody drive me. I wasn't able to drive, but we went. And as we started in the door, Bruce Carter, who had been my supervisor on the National Youth Administration, was just coming out. And so we shook hands, and he shook hands with Governor Kerr, and we went in. And as we went in, of course, Roy Turner had been up all night, and he was in his bathrobe and slippers, which was almost an imposition to ask anyone to see anyone at that hour of the morning. But anyway, he welcomed me, and Bob Kerr said, "Now, Roy, you know how much I've done for the campaign. You know what I did to help you. And so I have one request only. This lady took this thing for me, and when the Helena Institution was in such terrible condition, I asked her to clean it up, and she ran both of them for a year until we could find somebody, and drove back and forth to get that place up in shape." And he said, "I would like to ask that you leave it alone." And Governor Turner just laughed, and he said, "You know, this is real funny. The man who just left here was her former supervisor on the National Youth Administration, and that was his request, that she be left alone, because I had set a project that by the end of 4 years we would have every building cleaned up and painted, and we would have it in acceptable fashion through the help of the parents." And some of them were very generous in their willingness to help us. So he said, "I have no intention whatsoever of changing it, and we are going to try to have a mental health law which will stop this business of changing, because it's very hard on the children and the employees. They're all upset about whether or not they're going to get stay when the new person comes in." And he said, "This is something I don't want to have happen, and so I'll assure you that we are going to keep this thing as it is and hope to make progress." Well, as a result of that, we a little later he decided to start some progress on the mental health law, and I was a member of that committee, and Fred Chapman, Senator Fred Chapman, the southern part of the state, and Dr. Adams and Dr. Rayburn, and some of these old people in the field, and helped with it. And I think, I'm sure, Oklahoma was the first state in the nation to take the word feeble-minded out of the law. And I was given the opportunity to write the section on mental retardation. And we used the word retardation, which was the parent's choice. And it was everyone was admitted by application of the parent only. No judge, no county commissioner signed it. The parent came for a pre-admission clinic. And of course, we gradually got a little bit more money, not too much. We always got what was left after the mental hospitals were taken care of, but we managed. And so I think as a result of that, I had felt that no one should stay in a place more than 10 or 12 years, because everybody goes home on the weekend, and it meant I had to give up my church activities and all social activities, because I had to be there on Saturday and Sunday when everybody else was gone. And when things go wrong, of course, they always go wrong on the weekend when there's nobody there. So well, I was quite surprised. My son came out of the Army and married a girl in Seattle, and her father is a very wealthy man who bought a great deal of land on the other side of the floating bridge before the toll was taken off. And of course today that is priceless, and he always had a dream of building an airport. And since my son had been director of gunnery at Moorfield, he was privileged to build that airport, and they have a large project there now. And so it was very evident that he would not be coming back here. So I thought that we should move to that place. In the meantime, the man who, when the law passed, the steward became the business manager, and we were required to go to meetings at Oklahoma City. And Mr. Scruggs had been there 38 years. Between us, we served 56.5 years at the institution. And his salary was very small, as was mine, and we spent most of it on the family, on children. And so
he fell at the top of mountain in Bend, Oregon, broke his collarbone trying to help somebody else out of a snowbank. And so we decided that we would retire. The only person we had trained a man to, John Foster, to succeed us. The law required 5 years of active service in the institution for the retarded, plus a degree, and he was eligible. And so we asked him to go on his vacation, and we wanted to retire in that year. And then I don't know whether this was happenstance or whether it was planned. I think it was probably happenstance because I found later that these things are done quite in advance. But when I got home, after having asked to be relieved, why, I found that I had been suggested for the Hall of Fame. So Mr. Draper and several of the other people said, you just can't do it, you've got to stay here. So with the help of the legislature, and I have many friends in the legislature that I still hear from, who feel that it was a good thing that we did stay. However, I think 10 or 12 years is about as long as one should give a 24-hour day at that sort of thing. But we did retire in 61 and had the opportunity of having, my husband had emphysema and we knew it, and he was having a cataract grow on his eye, and it was necessary for him to have time away because you never get away from an institution. You are there. And so we decided that it was probably best. I have had the honor of being, and I say this with a great deal of humility, because I think that perhaps it was only as a result of people thought that I tried a little harder perhaps than somebody else. But I have been for many years a life member of PTA because I started working in the Parents Association when my son went to school and did it all through Phillips University. And I'm a life member of the Crippled Children's Society and a fellow and a life member of the American Association on Mental Deficiency, and I've been the administration vice president of that organization. And just recently I was made a life member of the American Psychiatric Hospital Administrators, and that is something I prize very highly because it is one that we have only 2 hospital administrators here in this area. One is John McMillan at St. Mary's, who worked for us at the state school, and my husband was responsible for him going on to school and getting his degree. He thought he should do it. And the other one is Georges Bond, who was my first student at the National Youth Administration, and went from there to the shipyard and then to the Army or the Navy, and then went on to hospital administration. And he is now the assistant. He was the head of Bella Madonna. And the interesting thing about it was that not too long ago, we were together at a meeting, and they were both there, and something was said about Sister Rita had left, and she was another hospital administrator. She was leaving. And they said, well, there's 3 hospital administrators. You taught 2 of them, and you're the only one out of work. So, of course, it was by choice. But there's one thing I would like to say, being interested in mental retardation all through the years. I feel that people need to learn and to know more about that field. It is something that in years to come we will overcome to a great extent through science and study and medical technology. But there's one thing in particular that's always been a great inspiration to me. When I went there, these boys were called by nicknames like Fatso and Humpy and that sort of thing, and I thought that was just terrible. So I would look at someone rather blankly and say, of whom are you speaking? And they'd say, "Oh, I just won't take that boy. I just won't take Humpy." And he was cross-eyed. He was hump-shouldered. He had he was microcephalic with a little pinhead, but nobody wanted him. And yet he wanted to work so badly. He wanted to work. He wanted a job, but nobody would take him. But every day, the house that the superintendent lived in was right at the corner, and then just a few steps away was the office where you enter, and possibly 100 yards. But even though he couldn't get a job, and finally, during the war, everybody was trying to win the war. And he used to say to me, "Well, Mommy," they always called you Mommy, "what can I do to help win the war?" Well, we had hogs at that time, and we butchered, and I said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll see if I can't get a cart and let you pick up the garbage from the houses, and that'll be your job. About 6 o'clock in the evening you can go around and pick it up," and it wasn't heavy to push. "And that'll be you'll be helping to win the war, because it'll go into the steamer and it'll be fed to the hogs, and that'll be food for us that we won't have to buy." And he was very pleased about that. But every night as I started home, he'd watch. He lived in the building right next to where the office was, and as I'd start home, he'd come along, and he'd put his arm on my shoulder, and he'd say, "Well, Mommy, we had a good supper." He'd tell me what they had to eat. "And, I'm helping to win the war, ain't I?" And I'd say, "Yes, you are." And he'd say, "I love you, and I love God, and I love everybody." And that was a great inspiration to me. But the most comical thing about it all was, one time I was required the business and professional women wanted to have a picnic, and we had a big backyard. They brought everything, and of course these mentally retarded people are very meticulous about their timing. If they're supposed to do something at 10 o'clock, they do it. And so we were having all of these tables decorated, and about 100 business and professional women and their guests in the backyard, and we had lanterns strung up, and everything was just beautiful. And just about that time, here comes Humpy with his big can on his cart right through the middle of the party. And he says, "Mommy, I'm helping to win the war, ain't I?" And I said, "Well, that you are, my dear. Just go right ahead." And he went right on back through the middle of the party. And that has been told on me several times. And I feel that one boy was a great inspiration. And I feel that we need to do a great deal more. Right now, I am retired. I take on more things than I should do. I'm teaching knitting at the Retired Citizens Group, and I'm getting ready to train volunteers for the nursing homes. We did do that, Mrs. Nussbaum and I trained the Golden Circle Group about 10 years ago for the Methodist Golden Age Group, and we are starting a new group now at the request of the owners of the nursing home institutions. And so I believe that that will be a contribution, because I'm in a position to say, if an administrator says, "Don't do that," someone thinks he's trying to hide something. But I've been on both sides of the desk, and I can say to the volunteers, "Now you just mustn't do that, because if you write a letter for somebody and say something unkind about some other member of the family and mail it, it might cause trouble." And people don't understand why the administrator wants to read the letter, and that's the only reason. They know more about it than the volunteer. And so I hope that I will be given an opportunity to do a little bit more yet in the way of service for others, because I feel that each one of us, every day, if we do something good for somebody else, it comes back many times to us. That's really good. And do you have any questions? I'll watched the time.
Would it be asking too much your age?
I'm 74. I was 74, 30th of March, and I think the greatest highlight in my life was the day I was 70. My son, who lives in Seattle, he was 50, where there's just 20 years between us. And he called and said, "Now, Mother, we'll spend our birthdays together. I want to take you to Victoria." And so we were going to British Columbia. So I went, and we left Seattle, went up to he cruises the month of August up there and stays at the Empress Hotel, and they all know him very well. And so he had made the arrangements for our dinner, and he said, "Well, now we have an appointment for dinner at 8 o'clock." And so we had been sightseeing, and he said, "Now we'll must get back and get changed." And they all, some of the bus boys know him, and I was not aware of the fact that we were having special seats, because it's a beautiful room that had just been done over several years ago when Queen Elizabeth visited. And it's all in red velvet, and it's a gorgeous room, the embassy room, and it seats about 150 or 200 people. And they do have a floor show, and it's, of course, very British and very high class. And the floor show was a very lovely solo number by a young lady. And after she'd taken her second or third bow, our seats were just exactly opposite the orchestra. And so he had made the arrangements, of course. And we were seated, and they're all couches, velvet couches, and they were just very lovely. Burl Ives and his wife were seated just a few seats away, and they had been on the ferry with us. And so in a few minutes after the lady had bowed, taken her second bow, my son said, "Would you excuse me a minute?" And so I thought nothing of it, but I had noticed the waiters going around lighting little red candles on all of the tables. And so the lights were darkened, of course, for the floor show. The spotlight was on that. Well, in a few minutes, the spotlight went over towards the orchestra, and all of a sudden, this voice came over the loudspeaker, "Ladies and gentlemen, would you bear with me for a few minutes? My mother is here from Oklahoma. Today is her 70th birthday, and I would like to have the opportunity to sing happy birthday to her. I have permission of the orchestra leader to do it." My son does have perfect pitch, and he has a very fine tenor voice. And so the orchestra struck up Happy Birthday, and everyone sang that. The lights all went out, and these little red candles all over that beautiful embassy room were on, and he sang Happy Birthday. And about that time, Burl Ives jumped up, and he said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, let us all sing Happy Birthday." And so I think that was perhaps one of the, outside of going into the Hall of Fame, that was one of the highlights of my life. And I just returned from Seattle for Mother's Day, which was the first time I'd been there. Been with him on Mother's Day since 1940. Thank you.
Yep.
Is that
You have
enough?
more?
This is time.
You got more tape?
Well,
Well, that's fine. That's good.